We've said for the longest time, what we do in integrative medicine should be mainstream, and pharmaceutical medicine should be the alternative. That if this doesn't work and you don't get better, maybe your body has degraded so far, you waited too long to try to get help, then sometimes you have to use the pharmaceuticals, and so be glad that we have them. The problem with mainstream medical therapy is the only tool in their toolbox is a prescription pad.
Hey guys, before we jump into the episode, I've got some exciting news to share. Our brand new website has just been launched and is live at paulbegleypodcast.com. This is now your one-stop hub for everything podcast related. So instead of scouring all over the internet looking for links to the show, you can stream every episode, watch our latest YouTube videos, check out our guest directory to see who's been on the show, and even read our brand new blog for extra content. And if you're enjoying this podcast, we encourage you to leave a review right on the site. There's no login hassle needed to do this. Everything's right there. It's easy to access, mobile friendly, and it's built for you. So while you're listening today, take a second to check it out. paulbegleypodcast.com. Now back to the show. Joining us today is Dr. Sherri Tenpenny. She's an osteopathic physician, medical researcher, and she's one of the earliest and most outspoken voices in the medical freedom movement. With over 25 years of research into vaccines and public health policy, Dr. Tenpenny has helped millions of people ask deeper questions about medical transparency, patient rights, and government accountability. She's also the author of her current book that's out right now, Zero Accountability in a Failed System, which is a powerful expose on corruption in modern healthcare. Dr. Tenpenny, it's great to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we get started, I wanted to make it very clear, I am not a medical doctor. I do not have any specialty credentials other than I'm a medical biller and coder, so I cannot diagnose or treat. Additionally with that, I also have a public health master's, specifically in healthcare administration. So again, I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose or treat. Public health master's really essentially means I can read and speak about these sort of things, but I can't make any sort of decisions. So before we get started, my first question for you, Dr. Tenpenny, so right now you're a board certified osteopathic physician, but your career started as an emergency room physician, and you served as the director of a level 2 trauma center for 12 years. So my question for you is how your time working in the ER and doing traditional, conventional type of medicine, how has that kind of shaped your perspective before you switched over to osteopathic medicine?
Well, osteopathic medicine is what I am. I mean, a DO is the equivalent to an MD, except when we go to medical school, we also get specialized training in osteopathic manipulation, which is similar to chiropractic. But, you go to osteopathic medical school and you graduate, you have DO behind your name. So you are an osteopath. And you do the same sort of work as a DO. You can be a neurosurgeon or an OB-GYN or like I did, work in the ER. It's the different type of training that you go through that, in my opinion, is better and more advanced than what allopathic MD training is, because they never really get any specific training in musculoskeletal systems. Okay. And so I think what you're trying to ask me is how did when I worked in the ER, what was my transition from a conventional medical doctor that was the director of a level 2 trauma center into doing holistic integrative medicine? I think it's really where you really are.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
So, well, a lot of that started way back in 1992. Maybe even been before that. There was a study that came out that it was referred to at the time, the Eisenberg study. And what the Eisenberg study was, this guy, and he published all of his research in the New England Journal of Medicine. He had spent several years in China learning about Chinese herbs and acupuncture. And then he came back to the US and he did a survey across the US and discovered that and this was in so put this in context, this was in 1992 dollars. So in 1992, Americans were spending about $1 billion out of pocket to go to what most medical doctors would call heretics. They were going to chiropractors and acupuncturists, and
Right.
they were taking vitamins and getting massages and things like that. And what was the most significant thing about that finding of how much money they were spending, they were not telling their regular doctor about it. And I still remember the day that I was standing in the emergency room. So this would have been 1992-ish, 92 or 93. And the whole hospital, I was the first DO on an entirely all MD medical staff. I was the youngest person on the medical staff and one of only 4 women on the medical staff.
Okay.
And I was standing in the ER, and I still remember it. There was this chill that went through the entire medical community. There was about 150 doctors on staff of that hospital. They were like, "What do you mean they're doing all these things and not telling me? What do you mean they're going to a chiropractor? What do you mean they're seeing an acupuncturist?" And there was just this whole disruptive thing that happened. And I grew up in a chiropractic family. My grandfather, my father, 3 uncles, and 2 cousins were chiropractors. So I grew up in a chiropractic family and was raised on Shaklee vitamins. And, so it had always been a part of my life. And so when all this happened, I thought, that's really sounds very interesting. I want to expand on that and find out more about that, because I believe that is the direction that healthcare is going to go, that people are going to want more natural things. They're tired of all these drugs. And so I want to look into this more. So I did, and I started going to some classes. I started going to some courses. I subscribed to a newsletter called the Townsend Newsletter for Doctors and Patients. A patient of mine had given me that in the clinic that I started, because at the same time I started my first clinic that I was open. I saw patients on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday just to do osteopathic manipulation and acupuncture. And then Tuesday, Thursday, and every other weekend, I worked in the ER. So I had 2 days off a month at that point in time.
Okay.
When I started the clinic, one of the patients that came in to see me, that I could do some osteopathic manipulation with her for chronic headaches, she said, "You should subscribe to the Townsend newsletter." And I go, "Why don't you fax over a couple of because I'm thinking newsletter, it's like 1 or 2 pages, folded over."
Right.
And she laughed at me and she said, "I'll bring you some." And I said, "Okay." So she owned the local health food store in town, and she brought me over a stack. And these were journals that were like the New England Journal of Medicine, except it was all integrative medicine.
Oh,
and
great.
This was a correspondence between doctors that were doing natural medicine and integrative medicine and what they were doing. And I was just fascinated. I didn't even know this existed.
Right.
And then the very back part, the last 2 pages, when you opened this journal that was, 150 pages long, the last 2 pages were a long list of courses that were available that you could go to. I couldn't even pronounce some of the names of them. They were psychoneuroimmunology and dark field microscopy and just all kinds of things that from a conventional training, what we learned in medical school didn't even exist.
Right.
So because I was the director of the ER and we made the schedule out 2 months in advance, I would flip open the Townsend letter. I'd pick out what course I wanted to go to, and I would plunk myself into the schedule and build everybody else's schedule around it. So for 2 years, I started going to courses once a month somewhere in the country to learn about integrative and natural medicine and holistic health. And then in 1994, I've been doing this, and then I had my little clinic where I was doing osteopathic manipulation, and I had a patient that came in to me and said, "I'm really perplexed. Can you help me pick out a good multivitamin?" I thought, sure, that shouldn't be so tough. So after work that night, I went over to the mall and went into GNC. And I looked around and looked at all the stuff that was there. And I thought, I don't know anything about this. I didn't
Right.
even know this industry existed, and all these different things that like phosphatidylcholine and phosphatidylserine, and what were those for and how did you use them? I was fascinated by that. And I walked away from, I was there for about an hour just walking around looking at the shelves. And the employee that was there said, "Can I help you?" I said, "No, I'm just looking. Thank you very much."
Yeah.
And so that, coupled with all the courses that I was taking, took me up until about 1994, when my business partner in our emergency medicine business, Dave, died of metastatic kidney cancer. And he was only 32 years old. And Dave was my right-hand guy, and we were very close friends, and we were just great. We worked together hand in hand, and I just felt so helpless. I felt like there wasn't anything that could be done, and I didn't know enough about vitamins or anything holistic. I didn't know about insulin potentiation. I didn't know about anything. And I thought, I've got to learn about this because this is terrible. So Dave died. I'd been taking courses for 2 years. I learned a lot about those vitamins that they sell at GNC. And then after Dave died, about a year and a half later, I decided that I couldn't work 28 days a month anymore. And I had an opportunity to move to Cleveland and open a clinic, which I did. So in 1996, I came to Cleveland and opened my first integrative medical center here, coupled on the backs of all that I'd been studying for the last 2 years. And I went to another class and came in contact with another physician who became my mentor for the next 2 years. That once a week on Saturday, I would take all of the cases of the patients I'd seen during the week, and I would call him. His name was John Diamond, he's also passed away too. But and he was out of Reno, Nevada. And every Saturday morning or every other Saturday morning, we would sit down and I would go through the cases that I had that I was stuck. I didn't have a clue in the world what to do with these people. And he trained me for about 2 years. I learned a lot from him. He mentored me. He told me what to read and how to diagnose things and how to treat people. And that was my transition out of conventional medicine into holistic type of medicine. And so when I finally left the ER and came for the first 2 years, so from 96 to 98, I would work in my clinic Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday till noon, hop in the car and drive 2 hours away back to Findlay, work in the ER Thursday night, Friday, Saturday, drive home Saturday night. And I did that every week for 2 years.
Right.
And when I would leave the clinic and I would walk into the ER down in the first hour, I felt really like, what am I doing here? I felt like a fish out of water, even though I'd been doing it for 12 years at that point. And then when I would leave on Saturday night to drive back to Cleveland, I was all saturated again into being an emergency medicine doctor after doing that for 30 hours over 2.5 days. And then I would walk into my clinic on Monday morning and I would be like, I'm just a quack. What am I doing with these vitamins and acupuncture? I'm just a quack. And it would take me like back in the old days. Remember, you're probably too young to remember this, but back in the very early, very first computers that we had, we used to, switch out floppy disks. You would take one out. Then that's what I felt like I had to do with my brain. I had to flip out one floppy disk and throw in integrative medicine. Then I had to take out integrative medicine and stick in emergency medicine. And I had to do that. And after 2 years of that, it just became too schizophrenic. And there were some things that happened that I just said, I can't do this anymore. And by that length of time, my practice for integrative medicine had grown enough that I could make a living off of it. And so I find my final shifts in the ER were in January of 98, and I've never looked back, and I have no regrets, and I don't have any interest in the conventional paradigm. And then over 30 years, we've just grown and done more things and expanded. And I now have a doctor, 2 PAs, a nurse practitioner, a bunch of nurses, and other staff that works at my clinic. And I'm always proud to say that we've seen people from all 50 states and about 18 foreign countries that they come to see us to go through our programs and get well without pharmaceutical drugs.
Wow. And so like just that account that you're giving those is extremely interesting to me, because when I was writing my thesis for public health, I did it on veterans with PTSD and CAM and integrative treatment methods for them, because I thought it was interesting too. Because I mean, before I did that, I was in the Navy and I was a hospital corpsman. Again, not licensed or credentialed with anything. They don't give that out to hospital corpsmen. But I worked in the hematology and oncology ward, and there was a lot of interesting things, obviously, that you see up there going on. But I had always heard about acupuncture and, manipulation and vitamins, and I mean, I'm still a big proponent of going into GNC, and looking for a supplement for, whatever I'm trying to fix or, make better in my body. Actually, I think GNC should probably go ahead and open a pocket pharmacy handbook that they have in the store, instead of just relying on people drifting around and reading things off the internet to figure out what they need.
Sure, absolutely.
But I've always found that very interesting, and I don't know, my viewpoint on, like, why does conventional medicine pretty much associate, holistic medicine or Eastern medicine as quacks or kooks? Well, I think it's probably a lot driven off of money, or you can't really make a lot of money giving somebody a vitamin C supplement. So, I mean, but again, that would be a huge thing, a huge part of primary care. If I were a physician, right, that I would probably give to everybody. Yeah, here's a multivitamin that works well. Yeah, you could use some extra vitamin C.
It's a lot more than that, Paul. I mean,
Yeah.
the whole industry of integrative medicine, there are all kinds of blood tests, saliva tests, stools tests, urine tests that are simply not taught, not known about. They aren't even available through your conventional insurance. Your conventional doctor doesn't even know they exist.
Right.
And it's always been amazing to me, and I've written a fair amount about this over the years, that conventional medical doctors, whether they're an MD or a DO, and they've got conventional training, that they claim to be experts in something they know nothing about.
Right.
And they disparage integrative medicine, holistic medicine doctors, call them quacks, when honestly, when you think about what happens inside of conventional medicine with all the oil-based, the petroleum-based pharmaceuticals they give you, and what we refer to as cut, burn, and poison, what they do with cancer treatments. A lot of us that have been in this industry for a really long time, and we're some of the groundbreaking people because we've been around for a long time, say that they are the quacks doing crazy things, not us, who look for root causes and try to identify what caused you to have this problem and correct that, rather than just giving you a drug to just suppressive medicine. I'll give you a quick story about that.
Sure.
I had a patient, this was quite a few years ago, that he had a very twisted pelvis. And because of that twisted pelvis, he had a lot of pain in through his sacrum and his low back and down around his tailbone that went right, and the pain shot into his rectum. And
Okay.
It was really painful and very like random. Like he could just be sitting here talking to you, and then suddenly he would get this searing, sharp pain that went around his tailbone and into his rectum. So it was really inhibiting everything in his life, his work, his everything. And he went to the Cleveland Clinic, and there was a new therapy, brand new therapy, and that this guy had created, and that he was going around the country and around the world talking about this therapy for people that had rectal pain. And what the therapy was inserting a probe into the rectum and burning the nerves at the end of the rectum so that they wouldn't feel the pain.
Okay.
And I said, could you just imagine what they would do to an alternative medicine practitioner who had decided that this was the way to treat rectal pain, was to insert a probe into their rectum and burn their nerves? Right. They would be sacrificed across the internet. Their license would have been taken away from them. They would have been crucified as the biggest quacks ever. But because it was done at the Cleveland Clinic and it was a billable procedure, and he had written a small book about it, he was making tens of thousands of dollars going around the country training people in this technique. So when I say that, how you define quack, I think needs to be relooked at.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially the same thing as saying, oh, you have you know, have carpal tunnel or wrist pain. Let's just cut your hand off. I mean,
Exactly.
that's pretty
Exactly.
much the same. One more question for you about the. Let me make sure I got this right. It's the Tenpenny Integrative Medical Center in Ohio. Is that correct?
Hmm.
Okay, one question about that. So integrative medicine. So I just for myself and the audience, because I'm not familiar with the medical center. Um, integrative medicine implies to me that you use both conventional and holistic medicine. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's, it used to be, years ago, this word in this industry has had a transition along the way. I mean, it used to be called routinely alternative medicine,
Right.
which really implied either or. You either did conventional medicine or you threw that whole thing out and all you did was alternative medicine.
Right.
And then it went to um it went to what's the next word after that? It went to
Cam.
complementary medicine.
Yeah.
So you were kind of like the condiment that sat on the side of your plate.
Mm,
The main thing was conventional medicine, but then you would do a little dabble. You'd like putting a little ketchup on the side of your plate. You were
right.
the side order there when they did complementary medicine.
Right.
So it went from alternative to complementary, and then integrative medicine is really what it should be, which means you use the appropriate tool for the job.
Right.
I've said the very longest time, if I get run over by a bus, please take me to an ER. Don't take me to an acupuncturist. If I have a ruptured appendix or appendicitis, I need to see a surgeon. If I have, if I have asthma, I can probably get medication to help me breathe, but I want to see my integrative practitioner to find out why I have asthma and eliminate that and put me on something that's more holistic and more natural, some sort of vitamin supplement, amino acids, things like that, glutathione inhalers, different types of things that are more aligned with your own anatomy, physiology, and biochemistry. So
Right.
so integrative really means, most of the time you use conventional medicine diagnostic tools because
Okay.
we have the best diagnostic tools in the world between blood tests and MRIs and CAT scans and things like that. Then once you get the diagnosis, go see your integrative practitioner and let them find out what's wrong and treat what is missing in your disease is only caused by two things. Two, and that's it. Too much of something or not enough of something. The magic of being a integrative physician is figuring out too much of something like heavy metals, mold, yeast, things like that, bad emotional things, all too much of something, or not enough of something, like not the right nutrients, not the right diet, not the right therapies that you need to do. So it's
Right.
figuring those things out. And you see your integrative doctor, your holistic practitioner for that, a naturopath, integrative doctor, maybe a holistic chiropractor. You see people to treat those sorts of things. But sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes you get all the right food, all the right supplements, all the right everything. And sometimes you need a pharmaceutical. You just do.
Right.
And so it's good to have that as a backup plan. We've said for the longest time, what we do in integrative medicine should be mainstream and
I agree.
pharmaceutical medicine should be the alternative. That if this doesn't work and you don't get better, maybe your body has degraded so far, you waited too long to try to get help, then sometimes you have to use the pharmaceuticals. And so be glad that we have them. The problem with mainstream medical therapy is the only tool in their toolbox is a prescription pad.
Right.
And if you can't fix it with a prescription pad, then send them to the psychiatrist because there's something wrong with the patient.
Right. Well, yeah. So thank you so much for making that distinction, just for everybody listening, because I don't think there's definitely not enough of these centers and this type of approach to medicine, which I also agree with you. I think that it should be mainstream. It kind of goes with what you're supposed to do as doctors, right? Do no harm first. So try to do the least invasive thing first for people before we start to throw any sort of medication really has a side effect anyway, whether it varies on the scale. But yeah, I appreciate you for explaining that to us. And I think the term you were looking for, I think, is complementary alternative methods, which is
Well,
which is a huge mouthful instead of
yeah, well,
integrative.
I was really talking about the advancement of the term. It started out as alternative, then it became complementary, they
Yeah,
call
right.
it, and then it's integrative. Now there's a complementary and alternative medicine division inside of the NIH, but it's
Okay.
very small. They may get, the last time I looked, and these numbers are just from recall, was maybe a $5 or $6 million a year budget
Mm-hmm.
in scope of the $1.2 billion budget inside of NIH, inside of the $1 trillion budget inside of the HHS.
Right.
So this is like a little teeny tiny division, and it doesn't get much play. And they're talking about eliminating it, which is really sad.
Right.
So
And
it's
I mean that goes back to what my theory is like, you don't make a ton of money off of telling somebody to take something away. You make more money giving something to somebody, right? As far as prescriptions go.
Well, most of the doctors these days they're not like our clinic that's a standalone center that I'm my own boss.
Right.
I pay my own employees. I don't use electronic medical records. We still have paper charts, so it's very private. There aren't many of us around anymore. We're kind of like the dinosaur, because back in the late 60s and through the 70s, even into the 80s, most physicians sold their practice. They were always independent business owners, always, like since the 1800s. They would, they talk about hanging out your shingle, because you literally did. And it was your business. It was your responsibility to market, to do whatever you do for a business. Well, when the weaponization of medicine occurred, which I write a lot about that in my book of Zero Accountability, is when they first started using electronic medical records. And then when the implementation of Medicare in the late 60s and Medicaid right shortly after that, where they co-opted all the doctors. And most doctors now are not independent practitioners.
Right.
They are W-2 employees that work for a big hospital system, that they have quotas they have to meet. They have to meet like the number of procedures, the number of blood tests that are ordered, the number of patients they have to see on a throughput. And so they make a lot of money because they're working for a system, and everything they do cranks money into that system.
Right.
And so I disagree with you by saying you can't make a lot of money doing holistic medicine, because all of us, have a nice living. We don't make $400,000 a year like an oncologist does, but it's not like we're all walking around paupers. That's not true. So I really think that, in fact, some of my colleagues make a lot of money. They have big IV centers. They do a lot of things, and it's all cash.
Right.
They make a lot of money, but they're independent practitioners. They're not cogs in a big system.
Right. Well, and I agree with you as well. And that wasn't even what I was referring. I was referring to, the conventional medical system as a whole doesn't, I think anyway, right? This is just making an assumption about what their intentions are. Is they don't want to promote things like acupuncture because there's not a lot of money involved with it for them as far as billing and coding and insurance wanting to pay those things out. I mean, and I think that your book, a lot of the information that we're going to talk about from your book, I have not read your book yet, but I did read RFK Jr.'s The Real Anthony Fauci. I think a lot of that probably has sort of the same similar context as far as, big pharmaceutical companies really having kind of playing puppeteer master for a lot of this conventional Western medicine and pharmaceuticals that are actually being given to patients. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, so at what point and what kind of triggered your interest in taking a deeper dive into vaccine policy and schedule?
That was it kind of happened serendipitously, just kind of like when I left got introduced to the Townsend letter. I was in my clinic and had a lot of young mothers coming in, sort of clutching their babies to their chest and saying, "How do you feel about vaccines?" And I was like,
Right.
I don't know. I really haven't given much thought. By this time I've been in medicine a long time. And when I started my clinic, I'd been in medicine like 11 years when we first started that. And then about 4 years later, I've been seeing patients for 4 years. And I grew up in a chiropractic family. I was not vaccinated as a kid. I had all the normal measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, pertussis when I was a kid. So I didn't think there was any big deal about that.
Sure.
Even when I was working in the ER, there's a policy that they have with children when they come into the ER. If they aren't up to date according to the pediatric schedule, the nurses will say, while they're here, should we vaccinate them? Should we get them up to date?
Right.
And it's a policy that's actually written inside of the CDC, and they call it capture. When you have them in front of you, when you can capture them, you give them every dose of everything that they need to catch them up, because it might be the only opportunity you have.
Sure.
Which is horrifying of what is injected into these children. So when the kids came into the ER, and they were usually there because they had croup or they had ear infections or sinus infections, or there was something wrong. And I didn't know anything about vaccines at that point in time, other than, giving out tetanus shots like they were some special kind of candy. And I would say, no, don't, they got enough. Their bodies have enough to deal with right now with this infection and the fever and all this other thing. Don't give it to them. They can follow up with their pediatrician or their family doctor about that. And that's all I really kind of knew about vaccines. And
Right.
this would have been 1998, right? So in September of 2000, I got a flyer in the mail to go to the National Vaccine Information Center meeting in Washington, D.C. And having these mothers ask me, what is my position about vaccines? I thought, well, maybe there's somebody down at this meeting I need to go and see. And every time I tried to throw that flyer away, somehow it would magically end up back on my kitchen counter. And I thought, okay, Lord, I need to go do this. And so I went to this meeting. There were about 700 people in attendance, a lot of vaccine injured kids in wheelchairs, and I was just, my eyes just popped open. And I sat through 3.5 days of meetings. And just when I came home, I said, how did I miss this? How did I not know anything about this? Because I was listening to parents of vaccine injured children, parents of unvaccinated children, listening to doctors talking about taking care of vaccine injuries, lawyers talking about vaccine court and the VAERS system and how bad it was at that point in time, listening to bench research scientists talking about the bad science. And I was like, how did I miss this? It's like you lived your whole life inside of this house, inside of your house. And one day you found a doorknob and you opened it and there's a whole world out there that you didn't know anything about. And that's how I felt when I came home from that meeting. And I thought, well, maybe I better look into this. So where do I start? And then I thought, well, the CDC is supposed to be the experts on vaccines. Let me start there. So the first paper I read was the General Recommendations of Vaccination. They come out with about every 3 to 4 years. This was the 1998 version. And I got done with this 40-some page paper and I went, this can't be it. This is poorly written, poorly referenced. It's like every reference was the CDC. So It would be like me writing a paper and all the references would be written by Sherri Tenpenny, you know? And so I thought, this can't be it. It's written poorly. It's got bad grammar. It's written very like to kindergarten level. Maybe I ought to read a little more. And so that became, now I've been doing this for 25 years. I've invested more than 50,000 hours of my life into researching problems associated with vaccines. In the first 3 years, I spent really digging into the medical literature, trying to figure out why we did this. I mean, after all, I wasn't vaccinated. I had the measles and I had mumps, chickenpox. No big deal. I'm alive to talk about it. Most of the people my age and older had those conditions and no big deal. Why are we doing this? Why are we injecting all this stuff into kids? And after 3 years, I was really, really angry because I could not find any good reason. It was just, and I was mad at the pharmaceutical industry for making the vaccines. I was mad at the doctors, for nurses for giving them. I was really mad at parents for never questioning, never saying what's coming through that needle and is it really necessary? Do I really have to do that? And then I decided that, you can get more You can you can make more friends with, draw more flies with honey than with vinegar, and sort of change to being like Joanna Appleseed, that my job is to just sow seeds and following the parable of the sower in the Bible. That some seeds fall in rocky soil, some get choked out by weeds, some get scorched out by sun, but one in four seeds lands on good soil and grows up to bear fruit. But you never know which factoid you throw out there is going to land on somebody's ears and make a difference. You never know where the good soil is, and you have no control over how long it's going to take for that seed to sprout and grow. Right. And that, for the last probably 10 or 15 years, has sort of been the perspective that I have addressed this issue from, trying to get people to just ask the simple question, what's coming through that needle, and do I really need it? And do I really need to get 7 shots at the same time?
Sure.
Because children get 28 injections by the time they're 1 year of age.
All right. And so I'm curious. So this has always been something I've always been curious about too. And I want to do a lot more reading about it. Right. So, I mean, my position, I would say, I wouldn't know how you would label me. I would say I'm curious about anything that you do give me. Now, personally, I've had all of my vaccinations, but I was also active duty military. And I was just kind of bumbling along like, yeah, whatever. Is that what I'm supposed to do here in line, right? My wife is still active duty military, so she kind of doesn't have a lot of say about, what she has to have on board. And then I actually didn't even really start thinking about this too hard until the last, I don't know, maybe 7 years. So my kids are all the way vaccinated as well. So I'm curious to see, because you mentioned about your research and referencing and starting at the CDC's website. So I've done a lot of that as well. And the thing that kind of irritates me, especially going through like the public health program, is, hey, use credible sources. Well, okay, so and it's almost like they make the CDC and WHO the gospel, which it's not. And I agree with you because, doing research, because I was finishing mine up during the COVID pandemic. So all of this real-time publications on the CDC's website were all just referencing, like you mentioned, back to themselves. I'm like, well, you're not the first person source information. That's not even good. That's not valuable. That's like not how you reference. That's like what, pharmaceutical companies do with drug trials, where they just fund their own research and then reference themselves. So I'm curious, where did you go for good information? Because even like PubMed and I forgot what the other online scholarly article journal database is called. A lot of those are also just influenced by pharmaceutical companies and CDC. Who, where else did you go to research?
Well, the articles are out there, but you can't just put into PubMed anti-vaccine articles and expect them to pop up. I mean, Right. It doesn't happen. So back in the day when I first started doing this, I was obsessed by learning, and it just, some things you pick and some things pick you, and this definitely picked me. And, I subscribed to the Pediatric Infectious Disease Journal and to the New England Journal of Medicine and several public health journals. And once you start reading them, there are a lot of articles that show that vaccines don't work, they cause harm, they're not necessary, and every single one of them causes an injury at some level. When you read through it, you get down to the end. And so many times when you read a medical journal article, you read the abstract, and then there's a 1-sentence conclusion of the abstract, and then there's the 10-page article. And I can't tell you how many articles I read that I would go through I would read the entire article, and I would get down to the end, and then I'd go back and look at the abstract and the conclusion under the abstract and go, how in the world did they conclude that from this information?
Right.
And they and physicians, all they ever mostly read is the abstract or even the conclusion of the abstract. And I spoke at a Northeast Ohio Osteopathic Association meeting. This was many years ago. And On the way to the conference, which was on a Saturday, I stopped at like CVS and I picked up a copy of Sports Illustrated.
Okay.
And I found a little obscure article inside of the Sports Illustrated. And so when I was talking to the group of physicians that were there, mostly men, and I said, how many of you subscribe to Sports Illustrated? And almost every hand went up. And I said, did you read the article about that was in this week's issue on the women's field hockey tournament in Brazil? And they blank looked and they said no. And I said, well, it's there. And I opened up the article and I turned it around and I showed him. I said, it's right here. I said, that's what you guys do with articles when you're reading your medical journal. You're busy, and so you flip through. You read the title of the article, the conclusion of the abstract, and you're just flipping through. And if you see an article on nutrition or on bad outcomes with vaccines or bad outcomes of a drug or something like that, if it doesn't really interest you, you flip right by it, and then you claim that it's not published and it was never there.
Right.
And I can tell you that almost every one of those physicians over the course of, it was a weekend conference, over the course of the weekend or in follow-up, they either emailed me or called me, said, man, you busted my chops on that. Because you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
To say they don't publish anything about nutrition in the New England Journal. Well, yes, they do. You just don't happen to read it because you're not interested in it.
Right.
And at one point in time, I had an employee that worked for me, and she would go comb through all these conventional medical journals and pull out the articles that showed conflicts of interest, showed, you would read through the whole article, would get down to the end and it will say, and in this trial, 7 children died. But study investigators said it didn't have anything to do with the vaccine. So with a swipe of a pen,
Sure,
they were just negated. And I had over 17,000 articles compiled in one place that showed problems associated with vaccines. And all of these articles were only from peer-reviewed published journals.
Wow.
So they're out there. It's just, you have to kind of read between the eyes and you have to go out. You're not going to go out to PubMed and just do a search and get a plethora of 12 or 20 or 50 articles like that. It's not going to happen. And so people like me and other people that do an awful lot of research, writing, and publishing have done the work for you. In fact, one of the best books out there right now, it's really pretty current. I think it was published maybe a year or two ago. It's got a kind of a strange name. The name of the book is called Turtles All the Way Down. Okay. And it's actually written by 3 or 4 Israeli doctors that wanted to remain anonymous. And it's a pretty thick book. It has over 2,000 footnoted references in there from mainstream journals. And it was published through Children's Health Defense. And Mary Holland and Zoe, whatever Zoe's last name is, they're the 2 editors on it. And they're the front of the book because the doctors who actually wrote it wanted to remain anonymous. And they're out of Israel. And it's written to the general public. It's very reader friendly. And it's designed for parents that are a little more educated, but they're beyond saying, well, what about polio and what about smallpox? Which is, when somebody starts a question with that to me, I say, you got a lot of homework to do. Sure. If that's where you're starting from. You know nothing about this industry. And it's like, I'm sorry, I don't, you need to go do some homework and then come back and we'll have a conversation. Right. It's like, I now teach, PhD students. I really don't have time for kindergartners is kind of how I feel. Sure. And because there's so many good books. Paul Thomas has written several good books. My book, Zero Accountability, talks a lot about flu shots and what's in flu shots, what's coming through that needle, a lot about the really toxic adjuvants that are out there that they use. So, there's a lot of good material. When I started this in 2000, there was pretty much nothing. I mean, Barbara Loe Fisher had written a book called Shot in the Dark. And other than that book, there really wasn't much around.
Right.
And so I felt really bad for parents who wanted to learn more, or they had a vaccine injured child and they were trying to piece together what happened, because there just wasn't much information out there. And now there is. I mean, I write articles every week about it. I do podcasts 7 days. We post podcasts 7 days a week. We write on 5 days a week on podcasts and 7 days a week on Substack. My book, Zero Accountability, is a big deal. I'd written a book it's about 15 years ago, called Saying No to Vaccines. It was very popular. And, I wrote a book called Fowl, Fowl,
Okay.
Bird Flu, It's Not What You Think. So I've written a lot, and I'm not the only author. And this hurdles all the way down for your listeners. If you really, really want a good read about each one of the individual vaccines, why they developed it, how they developed it, what's in the vaccine, what's coming through the needle, what is the potential downside?
I wanted to move on. Let's fast forward a little bit to 2019, 2020, right? And I'm sure if you Google Dr. Sherri Tenpenny, you can find the viral clip that everybody in the world has tried to put you on to try to defame your character, right? Which was a clip that was taken out of context anyway, and I'll let you address that. But let's fast forward to the mRNA vaccine. You were one of the first people to actually speak out publicly and warn about the risks of COVID vaccines when everybody else was kind of not questioning anything and jumping in line. Now, I was going through my MPH at this time, and I'm a student trying to get my public health, and then I'm sitting here thinking in my head and questioning, like, this is an experimental drug that's coming out. Even I think the last time that I checked, and it probably still is, it still was not FDA approved. It's still under emergency use authorization, which makes it an experimental drug. And all the public health officials, CDC, WHO, Dr. Fauci, everybody from the top down, right, is pushing this out like, hey, this is what we need to do. This is how we get past it. Let's get forward with it. And then, as everybody can probably remember, which we all want to forget, the longer that it went on, the more tyrannical it seemed. And they started, I was a government employee at the time. Even General Milley and President Biden sent out official letters to all federal civilian employees, threatening them with threatening language of, hey, you will take the vaccine or else, pretty much, which meant you're going to get fired. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw from the mRNA vaccine coming out and why you were so publicly outspoken about it?
Well, a couple of things. I was sitting at my desk, this desk where I am right now, and right over there is the television. And I was listening to the daily parade, of Trump and Birx and Fauci coming out and saying all their stuff. And I'm going, but this is released under an EUA.
Right.
They've already violated 2 of the 3 terms of an EUA, meaning that the product they're releasing has to be safer than what they're trying to protect. And I knew that the death rate, even at that point in time, was very low from COVID, which turned out after the fact, when they crunched the data, at 0.2% of people that contracted it. And then the second thing that they violated was that there couldn't be anything else out there to treat the infection, so they had to release this, which I knew was a lie from the very beginning, because we knew about ivermectin, we knew about hydroxychloroquine really early on. And I had done a search and found a study that nobody ever talked about ever, that there was a couple of pharmacists that got together, and they decided that there was probably some off-label drugs that could address the symptoms of this respiratory illness. And they had done a global search, and they had published this paper, and there was something like 42 or 47 drugs that could have been used during the treatment of this. So that's the second violation of the EUA. Right. And I was looking at the television, and I said, Lord, what do you want me to do with this? But I've been studying and talking about problems with just regular vaccines my whole life. And I just said, Lord, what do you want me to do with this? And I heard him say out loud in my spirit, I heard him say, carpet bomb the neighborhood. And I said, Well, that's kind of weird. Carpet bombing is a military term. Other than that, I don't know anything about it. So I looked it up, and it said, from a bombing perspective, to that you would spread the bombs as far, as wide, and deep, and as fast as you possibly can. I said, oh, okay. So we got to get this information out about how the COVID jabs can make you chronically sick or kill you. So I called up Michelle, my executive assistant, and I said, button up, Buttercup. It's going to be quite a ride.
All right.
And, within, this was the middle of March. And so then by May, I had already identified 20 mechanisms of injury of how the COVID jabs could make you sick or kill you. We did a very large, very popular webinar. And unfortunately, poor planning on my part, we did it on Mother's Day weekend. And so everybody was like, oh, I missed it. I can't, can you do it again? So we rescheduled to do it again. And between May and July, I found 20 more mechanisms of injury for a total of 40 ways that the COVID shots could make you chronically sick or kill you. We did another really big webinar and exposed it all. And then I've seen over the 4 years since that time, that was July of 2021. So right after the jabs came out, I've seen more and more and more studies that just confirmed what I had identified early on. So I did over 600 interviews in, just a little over a year. Some days I was doing 6 and 7 on the same day. I mean, I told Michelle, anybody that calls, the answer is yes. Just put them on the schedule and we'll just plow through it and get it done. Because I had gotten the message from the Lord, tell my people, get this out as fast as you possibly can, how these shots are wicked and how they're pure evil and what's going to happen. And I said during that time, I said, about 5 years out from when the people got the 2 shots and the boosters, about 5 years out is when we're really going to start seeing the carnage. People are going to be really sick. They're going to be dropping over like flies. And that's where we are right now. And then I said, about 10 years out, we're going to see the most rampant autoimmune disease ever. And I got that information from 2 immunologists that I had spoken to early on, one from Europe and one from the US, who said in about 10 years, the one immunologist said to me, man, we are so in trouble because the type of autoimmune diseases this is going to do, it's because the spike protein goes in and changes the DNA.
Right.
And most of these autoimmune diseases are not going to be responsive to the medications that are currently on the market. And so, I've never stopped, I just keep going and keep talking about it. I can't, the CDC's whining because only less than 20% of people are wanting any more of the boosters. And when I hear that data, I go, what's wrong with that 20%? Are they living under a rock? Do they have any idea of how many people have died? I mean, there are estimates, it's been more than 20 million people worldwide. And more than 2 in the expose came out, and this was several years ago now. So it's probably worse now than then, with a report that 2.1 billion people worldwide have been injured from these shots. And so, and they're not stopping. They're trying. Thank God that Bobby Kennedy, Secretary Kennedy, just 2 days ago has pulled the COVID shots from pregnant women and children, which they have stopped all over the world a long time ago.
Right.
He pulled that, and we're hoping that there will be enough people out there that will go, well, if it's harmful for pregnant women and children, I wonder if it's harmful for me.
Right.
They stop doing it.
And I mean, and so, yeah, there's still tons of things that we're going to have to wait and see, which I'm sure that you've outlined I don't know if you outlined them in your 2 writings. I think that these are books, correct? The 20 mechanisms of injury and its follow-up 20 more mechanisms of injury.
Those were 2 webinars that are still available. If people want to listen to them, they can find them by going to drtenpenny.com, which is our main website, and look under the education tab. Those are, and it comes with a booklet. There's a booklet, and then there's 2 webinars. Each one of the webinars is about 90 minutes.
Okay. Oh, so they're not books, so I misspoke. I'm sorry about that. So yeah, so that's where you can find those webinars from Dr. Tenpenny. But I was always thinking, well, first of all, I wanted to go back to the EAU. So I don't
You
know.
okay, EUA?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, EUA. Yeah, I have no idea how it's still labeled in that way, even after
It's
5.
never, it's the FDA has never officially approved its use. It's still experimental. And as
Right,
long as the EUA is in place and the PrEP Act is in place, which I talk about extensively in my book, Zero Accountability, as long as those things are intact, Pfizer still can't be sued,
right,
Moderna can't be sued, you know, J&J can't be sued, AstraZeneca, Sputnik, all the rest of them that were used here can't be sued because it's never been FDA approved, and the PrEP Act gives them complete liability protection. And
right.
the the countermeasure injury compensation program is just an absolute travesty. And I have an entire book, entire chapter in my book, Zero Accountability, talking about that. The title of the chapter is Sacrificed for the Greater Good. And
Well,
so
I was just curious though, because you mentioned it in part of your explanation, and that still holds true that it is violating the second part of, is there any other therapeutics that can treat? Yeah, there are, and there has been. So I don't know how you can still have it on the market,
well,
even as an experimental drug.
it's the reason why at the beginning of COVID, remember that the FDA and every mainstream media outlet was screaming, "Don't take ivermectin,
Right.
don't swallow that horse paste." And
Sure.
hydroxychloroquine that has been around for autoimmune diseases forever. Nobody, don't take that stuff. It's harmful. If you don't have autoimmune disease, you shouldn't be taking a medication that's treating that. And they had to shut that down, and they had to pharmacists, doctors might write the prescription for it, the pharmacists refused to fill the drugs all across the country. If you wrote for ivermectin, you took it to your local pharmacy, they would either say we don't carry that here or we refuse to fill it.
Right.
And so, doctors that even tried really hard to get treatments to their patients who were coughing and sick from this exposure of whatever it was, they were refused the ability to treat their patients. People died not so much from COVID. People say, well, there were 300,000 people that died from COVID. I beg to differ with that. People that didn't die from COVID, they died from medical malpractice. They were not given the right drugs in the right dosages at the right time.
Right.
And they died of malpractice.
And I
It's
think
like, for example, if you see somebody that cut their arm and they're bleeding out, they cut an artery and they're bleeding out, and the doctors were prohibited from putting a tourniquet on their arm
right.
to stop the bleeding. And so they bled to death. So if people died of COVID, they died of COVID because the doctors didn't treat them appropriately.
Right.
And there were thousands upon thousands of death certificates that people died from car accidents and gunshot wounds and falling out of trees and breaking bones, and on the death certificate they said their death was from COVID so that
Right.
they could get more money for that.
And I think that was also they were labeling the deaths that way. Really, yeah, like you were saying, if somebody got in a car accident and I don't know, got decapitated or something, right? They obviously died from that. But if they were COVID positive, it was a COVID death, which is
And
essentially what they were putting on birth certificates to pretty much get the numbers up for it. But I remember also that
there was a
time.
point in time when I said we don't have a pandemic, we have a plandemic, number one, and we don't even have that. We have a test-demic because the cycling speed the cycling rate on the PCR test was set so high that 100% of the swabs would be turning out positive. And we
Right.
discovered that when there was a lab in Georgia that 100% of the swabs that was sent to this lab, 100% were found to be COVID positive because the cycle rate was set at 40, which means everything that it would be positive. And to have every single one of your tests turn out positive is just statistically impossible in real world testing. It's just not
Right.
possible. And so then that's when a lot of researchers like myself and others really started looking into the test demic that we have. We have 80% of people are being positive because the test is faulty. And the reporting of the test was faulty. We
Right.
didn't have that high of thing going on, but they had learned how to weaponize fear. And that's one of the main things I talk about in my book, Zero Accountability. It started in 2005 with the bird flu in 2005, and they've created a template that they're continuing to use of this cycle of weaponized fear. And I've said a lot of times, if the Bible says, almost, around 300 times, fear not, if God bothers to repeat himself that many times, it must be kind of important. And
Right.
so we hope that the next round that comes around, which there will be another one, that people do not succumb to the spirit of fear.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a very, very powerful motivator as well, as we all know. I wanted to talk about your book, Zero Accountability in a Failed System. So I was reading through some of the summaries of the chapters that you provided to me. Can you give us some more book highlights about what all you're actually going into as far as fear, control, and profits are shaping pretty much public health decisions and outcome?
Well, I started this book because in summer of 23, we had this little upchick of bird flu that they started talking about. Oh, bird flu and now it's infecting cows and it's going all across the country. In my book, Fowl, Bird Flu, It's Not What You Think, spelled FOWL, like birds.
Right.
Fowl, Bird Flu, It's Not What You Think. One of my staff members found a copy of it because it was written in 2005, so it's been out of print for a while. And she said, "This is so good. You need to just change the title and re-release this book." And I started looking at it and I said, but it was written in 2005. So it's got a lot of Bush 2 politics in it. And,
Sure.
a lot has happened in the last 20 years. And so she said, well, then you need to do something with this. I said, well, I've written books before. This is going to take on a life of its own, which it did. And so it started with talking about, the bird flu, the historical H5N1, and went through the swine flu, different things that were happening, and the bird flu hype and the scamma Tamiflu. And I talk a little bit about influenza vaccines and what's really coming through that needle and how
Right.
they are disgustingly made. And I talk about human and animal cells, and some of the vaccines that are made, they're made from tumor cells. They're actually made from cancer cells.
Really?
And so we talk about the fact that the viruses are cultured in tissue, and many of the tissues are from tumors, from cancers, from tumors. And so we end up with a little bit of those cells being injected into our body when we get these shots.
Right.
I talk about human diploid cells, which are from aborted fetal tissue, that there's a whole bunch of them. I put a big long table in there of all the ones that we do. I talk about tracking and surveillance. And then the one thing I do go into a lot of detail on is the 40-year march to 2030. And because nobody in our health freedom movement really talks about the Healthy People program that started in 1980, and how each year, each decade along the way, it became more intrusive, more invasive, until it's just all encompassing. And that couples up with how public health became weaponized, and how the global vaccine agendas are all tied together, how it's all tied together.
Right.
And Sacrifice for the Greater Good is a chapter about the injured from the COVID-19 jabs, and React 19 and the covered countermeasure injury compensation program, which is a disgrace to this entire country, and how that needs to be changed. And all the quarantines that we went through. What is the history of quarantine? And when was it useful? And how has it become not useful at all anymore? And then the last chapter, tying it all together, the activist playbook, I really compel people to think about, they must get involved and they must know this information. So, it's like, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, that isn't going to happen. So most of the people that have read the book so far have said it's really dense, but it reads like a suspense thriller. And so it holds their interest. It's just not a bunch of dry medical facts. There's just stories that I weave inside of there. And so it's a really compendium of of flu shots and flu vaccines and adjuvants and tracking and surveillance that kind of cover all the things that we need to know about in the book.
Sure. And is there an audiobook available?
Not yet. No, this
Okay.
just got released about 6 weeks ago. So.
Okay, great. So actually, I want to move forward with it. And Health and Human Services, right? CDC, not WHO. That's pretty much a UN thing. But Health and Human Services is now. Everybody probably got extremely upset that was working there. Not everybody, but with the appointment of Secretary RFK Jr. What do you think about this appointment and his appointment as the Secretary of HHS? And what do you think that might mean? Do you see a change coming, or is there just too much bureaucracy for him to really make a lasting impact?
Well, I've known Bobby for probably 15 years. I've known him personally and professionally, and we've spoken at same conferences together. We've had dinner together multiple times. I mean, we've known each other a long time. And I'm really proud of him for what he's accomplished and the message he's been trying to get out, not only when he ran for president, but then when he coupled up with Trump and now to be the head of HHS. Because the head of HHS, the Secretary of HHS, is really the second most powerful person in our government, second only to the President of the United States. Right. He has over almost $1 trillion budget. There are many, many divisions. This HHS oversees a CDC, NIH, FDA, a CMS, which is Medicare and Medicaid. They're all underneath HHS and a whole bunch of other things. And with the announcement that he made 2 days ago about pulling the COVID jabs off of the women that are pregnant and off of children, I did a 2-minute video on that yesterday, and I said, we've been waiting for a while. In fact, we've been waiting 103 days because that's how many days Bobby's been in office.
Yeah.
And so we finally got that done. But it's interesting at how many people were like appalled by that. I mean, I was reading, somebody sent me a link on X on something else. And you know how some of those, when you're reading things on social media, you just kind of follow rabbit holes and you get sucked into all kinds of things. And I ended up over on a site, somebody had made a comment about, how they were so glad that this had finally happened, that we had taken the COVID jabs away from pregnant women and children. And somebody had made a comment that, yes, it's really sad that me and my husband are the only two people of everybody that we know in our circles that aren't sick or aren't dead. And then I followed her thread, and all of these people that were saying she's crazy, nobody's died from these shots and nobody's sick from these shots. And actually the people that were making the comments, they didn't feel hostile to me. They felt like naive, like, you got to be kidding me, people have died from these shots.
Sure.
And I'm reading this and I'm thinking there are a lot of people out in our society that have so completely bought the vaccine paradigm. They've never once questioned anything that's coming through the needle. They just, if they trust their doctor, and if the doctor says you need a shot, they get a shot.
Right.
And there's still a lot of people out there, and the powers that be are so powerful and so big, and they will defend that vaccine schedule to the death, because all of these vaccinated children, they become customers for life with their asthma, allergies, eczema, ADD, ADHD, insulin-dependent diabetes, neurological problems, cancers, all sorts of things. And so they go from specialist to specialist to specialist. They get more and more and more progressively expensive, invasive tests to figure out what's wrong with them. And it just cranks and drives the whole system. Because think about a completely well, healthy, unvaccinated child. They never go to the doctor. Right. They're not on prescription medications. They may go to the doctor once a year for a school sports physical or something like that. But they're bright, inquisitive. They're ahead on their milestones. They never get sick, or if they get a cold, it goes away in 48 hours. It doesn't, drag on and on and on. And so they've gotten, it was actually in 2010 when Bill Gates declared the decade of vaccines from 2010 to 2020, which I talk a lot about in the book on the March to 2030. And that began the really big push to expand the vaccine schedule. That now, when I graduated from medical school, there were 3 shots. In fact, a lot of people will say, I don't remember getting that many shots. Well, if you were born before 1985, that's true. Before 1985, there was MMR, DPT, and polio. They stopped using the smallpox vaccine routinely in 1972. So there was just those 3, and the kids got some of them. They never really got them together. It was not a big deal. And it was in the early 80s when they started pushing for kids to get these shots to go to school. Then after they passed the 1986 Injury Compensation Act that gave the pharmaceutical industry complete liability protection for any of the vaccines on the pediatric schedule,
Crazy.
It was the ramp of the schedule began. So now there are 17 different vaccines on that schedule, multiple doses of 17 different vaccines by the time you graduate from high school.
Right.
Full of chemicals, full of horrible toxic adjuvants, full of aluminum, and the multi-dose flu shots still have mercury in them.
So I'm curious, and I know you mentioned earlier, if somebody were to ask you the question, well, what about polio, right? I'm going to ask a question that a lot of people maybe that are watching this might be thinking in their head. Well, what would you say for somebody that would want to argue with you? I'm not trying to argue. I'm just posing it, right? Well, what about herd immunity? What is your response to somebody like that?
That you need to go look up the definition of herd immunity and then come back and we'll have a conversation.
Okay.
That's what I would say to them. But for the sake of your question, herd immunity was that concept was developed in the 1940s around a group of kids in a particular town in Massachusetts that had measles infections. And it came from actually having natural measles infections that a doctor that tracked this for years came to the conclusion that as long as 2/3 of the kids in the community had natural measles, they seemed to protect the herd and the younger kids from getting sick. And when that infection rate dropped below 2/3, you would start to see outbreaks of measles again until the herd would be re-exposed to measles again at the level that protected everybody from spreading and protecting them from getting the measles. That concept was co-opted by the pharmaceutical industry and rolled over, saying that vaccines do the same thing, which they don't, and that in order for we to get herd immunity with vaccines, we need to have a 90 to 95% vaccination rate. With when we had natural infections, it was 2/3, it was 66%.
Right.
And so that drives people. We've got to keep the herd immunity up. So we got to keep everybody vaccinated, and multi-generational vaccination is what we're seeing now. And we're seeing that's part of what, when Secretary Kennedy is always saying, about we've got the sickest kids in America and we have to find out why. I've written a couple of Substacks about it, and Bobby knows this. I called him on it. I said, it's really cool that you're cleaning up the food because it really needs to happen.
Yes, I agree.
Get high fructose corn syrup and food additives and food dyes and preservatives and all the stuff that should have never been in our food in the first place until we can call it highly processed stuff in a package that never molds and never rots or goes away because it's forever safe. Yes, we need to do that. But let me put this into perspective. If we lived in the Garden of Eden and we had the most pristine, clean food that God ever gave us, food, water, air, soil, everything was completely pristine and no contaminants whatsoever, it wouldn't make one squat bit of difference as long as we're still poisoning children by exposing them to vaccines in the womb, giving them 3 shots right after they're born, and giving them 7 shots at 2, 4, and 6 months in a year, to where we give them 28 doses of poison by the time they're 1 year of age. Before they sit in their high chair and they have their first food coloring, food additive laden meal, We've already poisoned them 28 times.
Wow.
And so we're not paying attention to, in all of the literature that's out there and all of the stuff that's been done. We're ignoring the elephant in the room.
Wow.
Because of the power of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, very much so. And when you went back to the explanation about herd immunity, I'm guessing the pharmaceutical company as well also funded a study to make that 95% efficacy.
And then they repeat it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And, over. And when you repeat stuff often enough and you hear it often enough, like safe and effective, you're safe and effective, then you just assume that it's true.
Right. Yeah, we've talked about that on multiple of our podcast episodes about news media and subliminal messaging. Essentially, it's not even really subliminal if they just say it over and over again. Eventually, you start to like, well, maybe it's true. I don't know. Right. So, question. So, so you're close with Secretary Kennedy. Then, I had a different question posed, but I'm going to ask because you probably have a little bit more insight. So what kind of changes do you see coming other than what you had mentioned already for COVID vaccine no longer I guess required for children? Is it children? I want to make the distinction 18 and under, or like the 6 months, because there's a different vaccine schedule for them.
What they have said so far, that in my understanding, is it's that we no longer give it to babies.
Okay.
And we no longer give it to pregnant women. Now, I don't know if that goes up to like 5 years of age. Yeah. I don't know if that's completely off the schedule. I haven't really read the fine print about that.
Okay.
But it's a step in the right direction, that those of us who have been doing this work, and how many hundreds of thousands of parents across the country that have vaccine injured kids. The autism rate in this country is now 1 in 31. And it's in California, it's 1 in 20 overall. And when when they boil it down even further, it's 1 in 12 boys in California. And they can match that to when SB 277 went into place and the right to refuse was taken away from parents. And we started to see this hockey stick of children that now have autism.
Wow. So back to my question, though. I'm sorry. What do you see actually changing, and what do you think will be changing as far as policies go from HHS?
Well, HHS has a lot of things. So, working with Director Jay Bhattacharya in the NIH in terms of cleaning up the science and doing true double-blind placebo-controlled, with the placebo being an inert substance, because they changed those rules in 2013. I wrote about that in my Substack this week, that a placebo in a vaccine trial or a medication trial can be if there is a similar drug or a similar vaccine that's already on the market, they can use that as the standard and call it a placebo.
Okay.
So they now call it a comparator and not a placebo, because you're comparing an old vaccine to a new one. So you never get a neutral baseline. So it's my understanding they're going to change that. Hopefully, Dr. And Director Marty Makary is going to get hardlined with the FDA. There's a whole bunch of other things that are educational projects and divisions. I'm not familiar with all of the different divisions within the HHS, but I do know that Bobby's main focus, Secretary Kennedy's main focus at this point in time, and remember, he's only been there 103 days,
sure.
So at this point in time is we have to make children healthy again, and we need to start with the food.
Okay,
and so that's,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, that's a good place to start. Now, I really don't know what his next focus is, because right now this is a huge focus. He's pulled together all of the big name food manufacturers like Kraft and Honeywell and all of these, and ConAgra, and had things with that. It's busy. He's super busy.
Sure.
And I think he's still kind of learning the job, like all of them are. And one of the biggest problems with politics that I see, and I've spent quite a bit of time down there, is you never know who to trust. And you know, when you never, it takes you a while to figure out who's friend and foe, and who's smiling to your face and saying yes sir, yes sir, yes sir, and stabbing you in the back at the same time.
Sure.
So I think that fortunately we've got 3.5 years or 4 years to do some things, and hopefully some of these things will get codified into actual law, and they won't just be policy or executive orders, so that when the next person comes along, they can just reverse all of it. So all of this good work that's being done to clean up our food and secure our borders and all of the, and you know, all those different things, it won't just go away. It
Right.
will be codified into law, which will make it much more difficult for it to go away.
Right. And I agree with you. I'm sure he is still learning the job. He probably won't actually know fully what he's doing until about a year in, right? I know he's been involved with EPA most of the majority of his career. But even from my opinion, uh, big food, the fight against big food is a good start. Even if that's really all he's able to codify and start to change, I think that that's a great success and a good path to put us on. But I would guess he's probably focused on big food, just pretty much FDA. That's kind of where I would focus at. Big food, and then also probably childhood vaccination schedule. You can read a lot about RFK Jr. on his website, Children's Health,
Children's Health Defense. And
Children's Health.
Children's Health Defense, he started that, and there's a lot of publishing and things too. Mary Holland is now the CEO and runs it. It's really not Bobby's business, or he's not really involved with it anymore. He's had to divest himself from that to
Sure.
become secretary. And so, but you can go backwards in time and you can read his book, like, you know, Real Anthony Fauci, and he and Brian Hooker came up with a book that just came out last year called Vaxxed Unvaxxed. And Brian's a good friend of mine. He's an impeccable researcher. And he said, you know, that they did that, you know, that they were looking to see, are there any real studies out there that really compare a fully vaccinated set of people to completely unvaccinated set of people? And he said, Brian said when he started digging around, he thought he might find one or two. And I think he told me they found, it was either 68 or 70 something.
Oh, that's way more than I would think.
And I said, really? He said, yeah. And then that's where, and then they compiled it into that book. So that's another book for you to read and your
Sure.
listeners to read. It's called Vaxxed Unvaxxed by Brian Hooker.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the recommendation. I've never even heard of that, but yeah, I would assume there wouldn't have been that many studies on that scenario as well. I want to do a few more questions for you. And you mentioned before, as far as the autism rate in California for children. And I think I was listening to a recent interview with you. I think it was recent anyway. It was published recently on YouTube. How do we protect patient choice and personal liberty? Patient choice meaning the right to refuse a drug, right? And pretty much you can explain a little bit better than I can, but my understanding is the right to refuse a drug, such as if a child is going to public school, their parents and the child can refuse a vaccination in order to attend school.
Well, I believe there's 5 states now that have no right to refuse: California, New York, Maine, Connecticut, West Virginia, and Mississippi. So I guess that's 6 that they have no exemptions, except sometimes a medical exemption, which is really hard to get. You can't get it in California or New York. And so, and all other states have at least a religious exemption. And then there's about 14 states, Ohio is one of them, that still has what's called a philosophical or a personal right exemption, which says, I don't want my kids to be vaccinated. That's all you need to do. You need to write a letter. You don't need a doctor to write it. You can write it yourself. That just says, I'm exercising my right to refuse. And parents need to be really vigilant about that and know that that is a privilege, not really a right. And they can take that away at any time if we're not paying attention. So that's one of the things I talk about in the last chapter of my book, Zero Accountability, is where is your outrage? I mean,
Right.
we got the government that we deserved because we took our hands off the steering wheel. We got COVID because we just agreed to roll over and say, okay, we can't do that again. We cannot do that again. And we need, and every state has activist groups. Every state has patriot groups. Every state has vaccine groups. Just let your fingers do the walking across the internet and find the people that are local to you. Everybody would love to have more people in their ranks. Either everybody, of course, needs your money, but if you don't have money, you have time. And let me, in closing here, let me give you my little short activist speech.
Sure.
So what you need to do is first you start with your family calendar that you already have in place, and every family has a calendar that they know where soccer practice is and basketball practice and music lessons and all this stuff is on the calendar. But every family's calendar has blank spaces in it everywhere. It's either, you've always got a couple of hours everywhere. And then you decide how many hours a week are you going to commit to the cause you want to support, whether it's a vaccine cause, whether it's a Second Amendment cause, whether it's save the whales, whether it's stopping human trafficking, whether it's getting rid of fluoride in the water in your community or glyphosate or whatever it is. Just pick a cause. Then looking at that calendar, determine how many hours a week you want to donate. Do you want to donate 2 hours a day or 5 hours every other Saturday or whatever it is? And you find those blank spaces and you take a black indelible marker and you mark off that time. And it cannot be moved except for death. You can't make an excuse that, so somebody invited me to lunch or something came up. It's like, no, I'm sorry. I'm really committed at this time to this group. And you can commit to them. And you do that committedly for 6 months. And then at the end of 6 months, look at the organization that you committed to and you say, I'm really making a difference. I really enjoy these people. I really feel like we're moving things forward. Then you commit to a second 6 months. If you find that none of those things are true, it's like, oh, this is a chore. I really don't like it. I don't like these people. It's not what I thought. Keep those dates marked on your calendar because now you're kind of in a rhythm. Just pick a different organization. Maybe you go from Save the Whales to the Humane Center, or you go to the homeless people or something like this. There's always a cause. Sure. And if it's not meeting your needs and you're not feeling like you're making a difference, then change the cause. But keep the black indelible marked dates on your calendar. And then at the end, and let's say you donated 5 hours a week, that's 250 hours of volunteer time. And if we had 10,000 people doing 250 hours, we could move the world.
Right.
And if you don't have money, if you don't have time, then try to figure out a way to donate some money because all of these groups need money for flyers, for gas money, for food, for print costs, for whatever they're doing. They all need money. And if you don't have the money, you can donate the time. And then if you donate the time based on the already existing family calendar, then you have no excuse. If you try to throw it in there like a ball out of left field, it makes chaos with what you already have, it'll never work and you won't stick with it more than 2 weeks.
Right.
But this is the way to be a long-term committed activist that you're committed to making a difference in the world.
Right. Well, I really appreciate that. And I would even go ahead and add a little bit more to that too. It's, my mom, Heidi, she talks about that as, a passion project or find something that's your passion. You could even block off that same time to, set aside for, focusing on your public health, going to the gym, right? Or meal prepping or any sort of thing really that you're passionate about as well. And activism leads right in with the same lines of thinking. So in closing, I just wanted to say, Dr. Tenpenny, thank you so much for your clarity, your courage, and commitment to educating the public. Your work continues to be a powerful voice for accountability, transparency, and patient choice, which we definitely need especially after going through the last 5 years.
For sure.
So for anyone who wants to dive deeper into her research and latest book, you can re-listen to this, where she gives multiple recommendations for reading, as well as webinars as well. We've created a guest page on our website for Dr. Tenpenny, where you can find her resources, links to her work, and ways to connect. And then actually, if you, Dr. Tenpenny, if you wanted to say the name of your website again as well for everybody.
Well, there's 2 websites that we have. One is where you can get the book, you can get our supplements, you can, look at the swag we have in the store, and that is drtenpenny.com, drtenpenny.com, drtenpenny.com. If you want to support us and become a member to support all the work that we do, if you go to shoptenpenny.net and click on the membership tab, you can find out all the benefits you get from being a member. And that's where you can register for being a Tenpenny Prime member, which gets you a lot of different things for a little amount of money, but it really makes a huge difference to our support. And at drtenpenny.com, you can find the book, which is Zero Accountability in a Failed System: How Big Pharma Weaponizes Vaccines, Public Health, and the Law. Or you can get it from Amazon. You can buy it directly from Amazon.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tenpenny. Check it out. I'll put all that information as well as in the description below this video. We appreciate your time and your voice, and may God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on the Paul Begley Podcast. New episodes will be released every Tuesday on all major podcast streaming platforms. For a video recording of this episode, you can watch and subscribe on our YouTube channel at Paul Begley Podcast. Hey guys, we want you to connect with us. Follow us on X and Twitter at Paul Begley Pod. We'd love to hear your questions you want us to answer on the show. For additional Paul Begley content, go to our website at paulbegleyprophecy.org. If you've thought about it, we'll talk about it. Paul Begley Podcast.